After this video is released, the mainstream discussion of anti-aliasing technologies will change forever. This 1080p 60 FPS scenario only takes 37% of a 12GB desktop 3060 while supporting interactive objects, extremely important shader-based anti-aliasing, along with utilizing expensive 4x MSAA. Hit that subscribe button before I show you exclusive statistics measuring how one of the most intensive frames in Half-Life Alyx is generated on your GPU. Slides covering light simulation concepts that will open your mind, topology lessons with additional warnings about nanite, and present profound information on anti-aliasing, including new approaches not a single content creator has ever shown to the masses. The reason why I'm going to provide such an extreme analysis of Half-Life Alyx is because every time it's referenced as a visual masterpiece, some AI upscaling shill walks into the conversation and dismisses the entire graphical approach because it uses ancient 2010 forward rendering. I'm going to show why that has nothing to do with the most important visual aspects brought in this game by explaining how forward rendering works. The first important thing you need to know is that this is a VR game, and I have a mod installed that converts it to a 1080p 60fps VSync to desktop experience. And I'm using these specific settings because higher options didn't add anything noticeable to visual quality. Performance is a major priority for VR productions because in order for VR games to look stable under a headset, they need to be rendered at a high pixel count and high frame rate. Now let's take a look at the captured frame. We have some translucence, a variety of materials, foliage, and one of the things that stands out to me is the geometric quality of the buildings. I will say this game is a bit odd because sometimes it looks realistic, but it has these elements of stylization that fall completely out of my interest. Now the lighting is mostly bait, which bumps up the realism to a major level. The bait aspects contain shadows, AO, and indirect lighting, but some aspects are dynamic, like some shadows, which relates to the first call in the pipeline which clears the last frame's 4096 by 4096 shadow map atlas. Dynamic shadows are only drawn within an extremely conservative distance near the player's camera. This is a VR specific optimization, so here we only get a 0.3 millisecond cost for dynamic shadows. Most objects are fully opaque and only utilize a vertex shader. The outliers are all alpha tested, but that's not the only reason why they're slow. Their topology is aggressive, and along with sampling opacity information in one texture, an additional texture is accessed, slowing the draws further. It's possible this texture is some form of pre-computed movement, but I highly doubt that, and we've discussed better techniques on this channel. Using the shadow map, some volumetric fog information is processed at a 0.7 millisecond cost, followed by 2 render target clears, which is then followed by the prepass. A prepass is when the GPU processes the frame's geometric depth first because it's the fastest type of information to process, and the GPU can use depth information to prevent expensive pixel work behind closer objects. I've discussed the numerous things that can go wrong with a prepass, but this game handles it really well. It excludes alpha-tested geometry and some smaller objects that don't act as good occluders. I still think there are some small objects the prepass could do without, but even these objects don't change how extremely stable the prepass is. Looking at this consistency and then going back to look at Days Gone's prepass or even Jedi Survivor's partial prepass is an absolute nightmare. These prepasses easily climb over a 1 millisecond cost, but here in Half-Life Alyx, it costs less than half a millisecond. In a deferred scenario, I prefer the prepass be closer to a 0.3 millisecond cost at 1080p on a desktop 3060. But don't forget that this is a 4x multi-sampled prepass containing more than 100,000 triangles, so it's pretty impressive. The next draw copies our current frame's multi-sampled information into a non-multi-sampled 1080p render target, taking 0.3 milliseconds. The copy only has a quarter of its sized reference for shading and indirect shadowing technique. Now this scenario doesn't have a lot of objects that make the purpose of this buffer very apparent, but our secondary capture has some dynamic objects placed down on this washing machine, and this shows us our next dynamic system. The shaders reference an AO proxy system, but it's probably based on the lighting technology paper from The Last of Us. It's also a dead ringer for Unreal's indirect distance field shadows too, but here in the source engine I can't find any confirmation of distance fields in use. This buffer was processed pretty fast with only 8 draws, but in our primary capture only 5 draws were used. Now, this shadowing information is referenceable for the lighting pass, and because this is a forward rendered game, this means the lighting is done in the Basepass. What we usually see in a Basepass is the GPU will process or reprocess geometry with their material shaders and textures so that geometry buffers can be created. Those are then used as input for the lighting shaders used towards the end of the pipeline. Forward shading is when the GPU processes the same geometry, same materials, textures, surface results, everything that would be computed for deferred G buffers, but instead of writing to any G buffers, the GPU evaluates the lighting and then writes the lit result into an MSAA buffer. That's why rendering with G-buffers is called deferred rendering, because the lighting is deferred later in the pipeline. The single buffer also makes additional geometry samples from MSAA much easier to resolve, which is partly why we don't see MSAA in deferred rendering too often. Deferred Basepass draw calls might initially seem cheaper as they usually hang around 15 to 23 microseconds, in comparison with this forward rendered Basepass where most objects are 30 microseconds. But writing to several G-buffers has a bandwidth performance penalty, and the forward pipeline doesn't have a 1 millisecond lighting stage or expensive anti-aliasing shaders waiting at the end of the pipeline. So it's pretty fair to see a slight bump in cost per object for a forward rendered Basepass. The first objects shaded are alpha-tested geometry that utilize opacity maps, with a specific MIP filtering for the alpha to coverage technique that utilizes MSAA to function properly. Remember, you want to render new little objects first to obtain their additional depth to help prevent expensive lighting evaluation calculations behind newer and closer pixels. After 0.3 milliseconds is used for the first portion, the first Basepass outliers are triangle-dense translucent tart meshes that occupy a large amount of the frame's surface area while using 5 unique textures for the draw. Analyzing the draw factors, the performance cost makes a lot of sense. The next outliers are alpha-tested tree branches that use 6 textures. The cost of the next 2 outliers has more to do with their surface area presence on the frame rather than major topology and texture count inefficiencies. But these 2 draws, like many in this game, use a BC1 compressed texture for color, a BC7 compressed texture with 2 channel normals and 2 other light surface properties, and a BC4 compressed texture for baked AO. Because the cost of object draws can scale with the total texture count, a better solution would be to utilize a BC3 compressed texture for color in AO. Because BC3 is just BC1 compression for RGB with a BC4 compressed alpha channel. Or the BC7 alpha content, which is actually only 1-bit information, could be stored in the BC1 alpha channel, making room for the AO content in the higher quality BC7 texture. The next outlier draw uses a somewhat dense mesh with 5 similar textures. The next outlier takes more than 0.1 millisecond to render. Now this draw obviously has a lot of expensive lighting calculations done across the frame's surface area, but I really want to discuss the topology, and we can easily do that with the wireframe view. Rendering the mesh is actually pretty fast. If the topology was really terrible, we would have seen it spike in the prepass, but the zigzag topology increases the chance for quad leakage, which is multiplied by MSAA. Any place where MSAA is essentially triggered, it's like having multiple baseline issues. The baseline issues for this mesh are the 5 unique textures used for the draw and its placement on the scene that makes it visible across so much of the frame's surface area. I'd rather see more triangles implementing max area topology to increase full quad utilization than stripe-based topology with less triangles. The next outlier shows a mesh type where quad over draw isn't avoidable, so we end up with a reasonable timing regardless. Draw 1333 cost around 60 microseconds, and that's pretty good considering its various factors. Draw 1514 shades a somewhat high amount of pixels along with using 5 unique textures. Draw 1596 renders a large amount of pixels using 5 unique textures. The draw right after that one renders a much smaller amount of pixels, but our camera perspective aligns many of the mesh's triangles into dense areas where quad utilization and MSAA are going to launch the draw cost higher. Draw 1697 draws a significant amount of pixels while using 4 textures, 2 of which are practically the same but with a grime filter. Draw 1756 renders more pixels at a smaller cost. It only uses 2 textures, but the dense wireframe suggests MSAA drove up the cost. Draw 1883 is an extremely low poly mesh containing only 172 triangles, but it's responsible for a lot of pixel rendering multiplied by 5 unique texture assets. The last major outlier is Draw 1884, which ends up being the gun, which has everything going against it. The topology makes sense considering the asset, but it was an outlier in the prepass, suggesting definite mesh-based inefficiencies. This doesn't mix well with MSAA multiplied light evaluations needed across so many rendered pixels. It also uses 6 individual textures. For an unknown reason, a short amount of draws temporarily render exclusively to the depth buffer and then resume shading the main lighting buffer with sky and distant H-light info. About 1 millisecond is used to downsample versions of the 2 main render targets to draw particles, fog, and bloom effects. The image is then color graded in 0.17 milliseconds and the UI draws take 58 microseconds to finish the frame. This adds up to a 6.36 millisecond cost, which is pretty close to the estimated millisecond timing derived from the GPU usage and VSync to 60 FPS. Now this is already a very fast, well-optimized scene, but say we had better exclusion logic for the prepass and crawled back a pessimistic but reasonable 20% gain from fixing these 8 outliers. The difference would offer 10 FPS. That's pretty significant if you're on lower end hardware, and it provides good budgetary room for extra morphological anti-aliasing. Now we need to discuss how we can enhance this scenario's realism. Now the textures for this game are great. They don't get any more real looking, but despite looking really good in this game, there's a specific aspect to the graphics that hurts the realism factor. And that would be the lighting model that this game uses. There are different lighting models ranging in physically based accuracy and calculation expense, used to simulate surface roughness and specular interaction with local lighting data. These lighting models are usually surnames after the people who were involved with their publications. Nayar, Lambert, Chan, and Burley are all diffuse models. Chan and Nayar are a bit more accurate, but the majority of games use cheaper approximation models. Then, there's also different specular models like Blend Fong, Cook Torrents, and the most recently used model, due to its fair cost and accuracy, is the GGX model. Source Engine, or at least during the time of production of Half-Life Alyx, was using the oldest and inaccurate Blend Fong model, along with a lackluster Lambert diffuse model. That's why a lot of people will subconsciously detect a strong artificialness despite the light map accuracy. But it has nothing to do with forward rendering. Both types of rendering can swap out the models for better or worse. But let's talk about one of the more positive aspects regarding lighting, being MIP filtering for anti-aliasing. Textures are almost never a single asset. They are MipMapped in memory. MipMaps are pre-computed lower resolution additions to the texture to prevent aliasing when that texture is far or viewed with grazing angles. The smaller MIPs also help the GPU process less information in memory for many scenarios. A lot of specular aliasing comes from normal and roughness information, and the common way MipMaps are generated for games degrade that information in a way that causes shimmering. The developers of Half-Life Alyx built off a number of more complicated solutions regarding custom MipMap filtering to combat specular aliasing, and ended up with something pretty effective for Half-Life Alyx. The modern CryEngine, Infinity Ward engine, and probably more, also have in-engine precautions for this rendering anomaly. Unreal Engine, on the other hand, ultimately decided not to implement any kind of specular filtering because they defaulted to their TAA, which obliterates basic motion clarity. Epic Games has handled this common issue with a garbage algorithm instead of investing time and money into a workflow that offers an authentic solution. So from now on, you need to hold anybody claiming we need smear-prone, blurry TAA to combat modern shading, because modern shading is not the reason why most scenarios are a shimmery mess without poorly implemented TAA. You do not need some incompetent proprietary software that limits you to a specific hardware vendor. You need developers and companies who are passionate about quality. Now this MIP filtering approach is not the only trick up this game's sleeve. Alex Velakos, who worked at Valve at the time, also came up with an extremely cheap, shader-based approach that minimizes specular aliasing on a geometric level. And because it's only around 5 lines of code, even Epic dished out a good $5 to implement it as a poorly documented material option. If you think this shader trick is pretty cool in Half-Life Alyx, you should be excited to know that it's been updated and improved twice. First by Nvidia and then again by Square Enix. The Square Enix version is integrated inside Godot, while our industry standard UE5 is still using the old Valve version. The shader also uses 2 derivative functions, which are known to be slow on nanite meshes. The last thing I want to address is the visual impact of 4x MSAA, so that afterwards you can perfectly understand its properties against TAA. I've described quad rendering in several of my videos, and basically MSAA will extend the range of each quad. Here is a capture with the MSAA resolve removed, and we need to take a look at the edges of this van. Focus on these edges. When we add back MSAA, you're seeing a very specific 4x MSAA resolve pattern with some pixel blending of the background colors. Morphological anti-aliasing would actually smooth these jagged lines in a way that would resemble higher quality MSAA. A popular belief is that the edge smoothing is blur, which results in some people reducing anti-aliasing as just image blur. And this mentality has been used to defend the extreme blur incompetent TAA causes in motion. The concept of blurring an image is to average all your local colors to create a softened version of the original graphic. Anti-aliasing and jagged lines are a byproduct of rendering geometry at a limited pixel/sample density. Because we can easily perceive the geometric discontinuities, we use anti-aliasing to connect the edges in a way that emulates higher resolution sampling. A geometric edge smoother is nothing like image softening. The main contributors of the anti-aliasing is just blur misconception are MLA and TAA, because TAA obviously blurs motion, MLAA like SMA affect textures, MLAA like FXAA have separate blur functions in addition to their edge smoothing to filter other image concerns. bad downsample filters, and because none of these can replicate a profound behavior seen exclusively in MSAA. We can analyze this unique behavior when we add back MSAA to the rest of the image. You may not notice it at first, but this new line of pixels is a huge deal, because it's not information that could have been derived from edge pattern detection. It's real, geometric information that could have only been detected on a sub-pixel basis. The geometric sampling allows you to better perceive the distant corner of the van's geometric architecture. When you understand this behavior in MSAA, you can easily understand its impact on the rest of the frame. MSAA in forward rendering provides more pixel-evaluated geometric detail, allowing you to perceive a more coherent scene despite no change in resolution or without blurring any textures. Another false but very prominent misconception surrounding MSAA is that it doesn't help with specular aliasing, and this has been pushed by content creators who show these neglected scenarios with no texture or shader-based specular anti-aliasing, and claim MSAA is worthless for modern shading, blah blah blah. The truth is that there's two types of specular aliasing. Some of it comes from materials, textures, etc., and then there is geometric specular aliasing. And this happens when the normals or direction of certain triangles are facing away from the camera and can't be sampled enough by the generic sampling grid. 90% of temporal instability in a scene is exclusively perceptible in the world normal scene. This is why supersampling is so effective in this area, because you're throwing more samples at undersampled normals. But because it's geometric, MSAA is also effective against it. Take a look at this chair. Because this is forward rendering, I have no world normal G-buffer that makes this easy to point out, but the normals that you would find in a G-buffer are still calculated for the final lighting, and we can see that in where the geometry is facing up in an undersampled fashion. MSAA will do two things. It will sample more geometry facing up, making it less broken apart, but it will also sample other geometry nearby with more common normal values that end up being used in the resolve process, reducing the contrast of undersampled normals, making them less perceivable. Now that you understand MSAA a bit better, TAA starts to make a lot of sense. It also works on a sub-pixel level like MSAA, but there are two major differences. It's only one sample and its sub-pixel position is switched every consecutive frame. The positions are repeated, creating patterns that can be programmed to mimic the standard MSAA patterns. This can result in similar resolve patterns. Without accumulation code and enough FPS, this ends up looking like jitter, which is why it's called sub-pixel jitter, and it's basically free. A good video explaining why it's free is made by K's Emanuar. But unlike MSAA, TAA sampling is not exclusive to geometry. It's the whole scene. That means textures which already have a form of anti-aliasing get oversampled and blurred. Many engines will bias the MipMaps to appear more aliased before TAA is applied, but that falls apart during disocclusion and textures still don't look as good. A less discussed alternative for textures is jittering the UVs in a synchronized fashion with the current frame's sub-pixel coordinate. This makes sub-pixel jitter look like you're only sampling geometry like MSAA, and it's a cheap shader addition too. Well, as long as you're not using it with nanite, of course. There's also been temporal MSAA such as TXAA and MFAA, and MLA-enhanced MSAA, but I'd rather dig deeper into those for another video. Our Patreon members will get their hands on an additional pixel-synced MFA and SMA image for personal analysis. A lot of modern rendering we're stuck with these days neglects so many aspects regarding noise and anti-aliasing, and people pretend that smear-prone TAA will clean it up, when it clearly won't under motion or disocclusion. If you're a fan of smear-prone TAA to the point where you rather sacrifice detail in the name of stability, it doesn't harm you to have a graphics pipeline that is built around stability. It will actually reduce visual artifacts on your end regardless, but it harms the majority of people who want competently designed TAA to use a pipeline founded on ineffective temporal smear abuse. The last thing I need to address is the cost of MSAA. It's not, oh, MSAA makes me lose 50 frames. It's dependent on quad overdraw, topology, and the amount of alpha to coverage masked content you have on screen. It increases the cost of geometry timings, and it should be, because you're rendering more geometry. 2 times MSAA is not enough unless you're using persistence jittering to achieve 4 samples at 60 FPS, and I don't see 8 times MSAA being viable in most scenarios. But 4 times MSAA looks really good in an anti-aliased environment such as this one in Half-Life Alyx. The whole game is only taking 37% of a desktop 12GB 3060, when most of the geometric timings shown in our analysis only take up around 30% of budgets smaller than 16 milliseconds. If someone says, oh, I don't like MSAA because it doubles the cost of my geometry, then you already know their non-MSAA geometry timing is unoptimized, because if topology was optimized, multi-sampling is not going to have a major performance impact, But if your geometry lines are spread across the screen, triggering more and more multi-sampled quads, more geometric evaluations, etc., then yes, you can lose a significant amount of performance. But as far as I'm concerned, this game proves 4x MSAA is viable with realistic architecture and modern art styles. Proper topology will either enhance performance or stabilize the cost of dense triangles needed in curved modern geometry. In combination with all the things mentioned in this video, it should be clear that there is a lot of performant and sustainable image quality that is being left on the table. The biggest issue we encounter with MSAA is that it's not easy to implement in deferred rendering, but it's not impossible. We use deferred rendering because of its compatibility with multiple light sources and screen space effects. Then after the mass adoption to deferred rendering, we ended up developing forward plus rendering, which brings the lighting benefits of deferred rendering into forward rendering. But the whole point of this video was to show relevant concepts brought in this forward rendered game into the deferred discussion. So the last thing I'm going to do in this video is present another technique compatible with both rendering approaches. I'm excited to distribute information about a new anti-aliasing technique developed by Johan. Johan is a rendering engineer who's worked at Slightly Mad Studios and has been working on a small simulator to showcase some of his recent graphics engineering work. Around 7 years ago, he was also working on a VR game and wanted to guarantee 60 FPS on 970 level GPUs. He was also looking to eliminate shimmer without brute forcing with MSAA. He basically found that a lot of specular aliasing found on surfaces in other games were coming from calculated normals that were incorrect or implausible from the camera's perspective. If you've watched my Alan Wake analysis, you'll understand that these incorrect normals are going to affect what parts of a Q map are sampled and can even skew screen space reflection results. It's a good thing that I explain lighting models in this video because there's another aspect to these lighting models that incorporate an effect called Fresnel. The Fresnel effect in real life and what we try to replicate with algorithms like Fresnel Schlick is when the reflectivity of a surface increases the more angled our view of the surface is. The MJSV games implemented the phenomenon in a much more noticeable way in their materials. But Johan further proved the Fresnel theory when he took photographs of his car bonnet. And what he noticed is that we perceive edges in real life based on reflections rather than the physical edges of surfaces. This is a pretty compressed image, but you're probably thinking the edge of this car bonnet is the black line. If we zoom in, he highlights the real edge of the car bonnet and points out the Fresnel effect causes the physical edge to mirror its background. The way Johan sees it is that the flat nature of triangles will always cause incorrect normals on surface edges, which also happens to be where aliasing occurs. So he applied a small shader change to how edge normals are calculated inside the pixel shader, so that extremely obtuse reflection vectors can be generated and read by screen space reflections. This is also why he needed to slightly tweak his engine's Fresnel approximations so that these new obtuse vectors can mirror the pixels behind them. This is a comparison showing off Johan's Fresnel AA, and it's not supposed to fix all aliasing, but anyone with eyes can see it makes a huge difference in jagged aliasing and edge normal quality. Here's another image he sent me showing off his shader tweaks, with of course no morphological or subpixel AA applied. You can see there's no apparent jagged edges because on a tiny pixel level, SSR is blending the physical surface with the background via corrected edge normals. Johan's SSR uses a half-resolution copy of the pipeline's last frame and reads off of that with the current frame's reflection vectors. The shader trick works well with high-definition meshes with proper baking, but lower poly meshes with several errors cannot be fixed with his shader tweaks. While Johan doesn't doubt other tools are adequate, in his findings he confirmed that Marmoset and Insta-LEDs are tools that bake normals to an adequate level. Additionally, he found several issues with Unreal's default template assets. I asked Johan how compatible his shader tweak would be with the max area topology scheme, and I wanted his thoughts on the outlier mesh we found in Half-Life Alyx to see if the topology changes we suggested earlier would conflict with his AA technique. While he states high-definition meshes work better with Fresnel-based anti-aliasing, in this overall rendering correction, max area topology would not conflict because it's not something that affects curve topology. We both agree that max area topology will allow artists to pack in geometric detail and game assets as long as they balance that expensive detail with high-performant flat surfaces on the same or neighboring meshes. I think I've covered as many core topics as I could for this video. Special thank you to Johan for trusting us to share his brilliant research and improvements with our Threat Interactive viewers. If you're a viewer looking into graphic solutions that align with our vision for better game visuals, and you'd like to have more exposure, then send us an email outlining your research. If this video was valuable to you because it taught you something new, was insightful, or even just interesting, then help us change the industry by sharing our content on social media and hitting that subscribe button. We can see in our stats that 48% of our viewers still haven't subscribed yet, but the larger we grow, the stronger you become. because we are fighting for a better future for both the consumer and developer. We received an overwhelming amount of requests to analyze the Oblivion remaster only a day after that game was released, but we had already began production on this video. In case you missed this announcement in our last video, we finally have a Patreon, with 3 different levels and the lowest tier just starting at $5 a month. To our current Patreon supporters and Super Thank contributors, we want to shout out and thank you so much. Your support keeps us afloat. We appreciate you watching our content and do keep a lookout for our next video.